Have you ever felt as though something inside you was broken, not in a way anyone else could see, but in a way you could feel the moment you lay down at night, when the noise of the day finally stopped? Have you ever longed to be whole, not just healed of your failures, but restored to something you sense you were always meant to be? Something you can almost remember, but cannot quite name. And have you ever wondered in those long, quiet hours whether God had forgotten you, whether your wounds were too ordinary for his attention, whether the kind of restoration you ached for was something he gave only to the extraordinary? There was a man in the mountains of southern Italy who bore for 50 years the wounds of Christ in his hands, his feet and his side. He bled, he suffered, he interceded. And in that suffering, he became perhaps more than any figure of the modern age, a living sign that God does not abandon the broken soul. He restores it, slowly, precisely, the way a master restorer returns to a damaged painting, not with a broad stroke, but with the most careful, loving attention to every cracked detail. His name was Padre Pio. And what he knew about God, what God taught him, through decades of pain, prayer, and grace, is exactly what you need to hear today. Subscribe, because every week this channel brings you the wisdom of the saints' wisdom that does not flatter you, but actually heals you. There is a particular kind of suffering that has no dramatic name. It is not the suffering of catastrophe, not the grief of sudden loss, not the shock of betrayal, not the collapse that everyone around you witnesses. It is quieter than that. It is the suffering of incompleteness, the sense that something in you is not working the way it was made to work, that your love is smaller than it should be, that your faith is thinner, that your courage keeps failing you in the small private moments when no one is watching. You go to confession, and you leave lighter, but not for long. You pray, and there are days it feels like speaking into an empty room. You make resolutions, and you break them, and you make them again, and something inside you begins to wonder whether you are simply not the kind of person who changes, not the kind of person God uses, not the kind of person who gets restored. Padre Pio knew this interior landscape, not from theology alone, but from lived experience, decades of spiritual combat, of darkness, of doubt pressing up against faith like cold water against a flame. He was not a distant, untouchable mystic. He was a man who wept in his confessional, a man who, in his letters to his spiritual directors, described the interior life with the raw honesty of someone who had nothing left to hide. He wrote in one of his early letters that he felt as if my soul were a battlefield, not a moment of weakness, not a passing temptation, a sustained, grinding interior war, and yet, through it all, the hand of God never once let him go. This is the first thing Padre Pio teaches us. The soul that knows it is broken is already closer to God than the soul that believes it is fine. Think about that for a moment. Sit with it. The Pharisee in the temple did not know he was broken. He was grateful politely, precisely, correctly grateful that he was not like other men. He tithed, he fasted, he prayed, and Jesus looked at him and saw a man sealed inside himself, unreachable, because he had convinced himself there was nothing in him that needed God's hands. But the tax collector God, be merciful to me, a sinner, that man was already in the posture of restoration, not because his sins were more forgivable, but because his awareness of his need created the only opening through which grace can enter. Padre Pio understood this truth, not abstractly, but in his body. He bore the stigmata, the wounds of Christ, for 50 years. And the Church has always understood the stigmata not as a reward for holiness, but as a participation, a sharing, God drawing a soul into the very place where Christ was most broken, so that through that brokenness, something whole could be made visible. What does this mean for you sitting here, carrying whatever you are carrying? It means that the very longing you feel, the ache to be different, better, more whole, is not evidence of your failure. It is evidence of grace already at work. You do not long for what you have no capacity to receive. The thirst itself is a sign of the water. Padre Pio once told a spiritual directee, "Do not be afraid of the struggle. God permits it because he trusts you with it, not because God is indifferent to your pain, but because he knows the difference between suffering that destroys and suffering that carves space for something larger, truer, more permanent than what was there before. The soul that knows it is broken has already done the hardest thing. It has stopped pretending. And God, the God of Padre Pio, the God of the Gospels, the God who knelt in a garden and sweated blood, because the cost of your restoration was not small, that God does not walk away from the one who has stopped pretending. He leans in closer. He begins the work. And the work he does is not a quick patch. It is not a surface correction. It is something far more costly and far more beautiful, a restoration from the inside out, beginning in the place you least expect, continuing in the dark, completed in the light of a morning you cannot yet see. You are not too far gone. You are not too ordinary. You are not the exception to his mercy. You are exactly the kind of soul he came for. There is something deeply uncomfortable about the way God restores. We imagine it as a moment, a dramatic turning point, a prayer answered with sudden clarity, a wound that closes overnight, a habit that simply loses its grip on us one blessed morning and never returns. We want restoration to feel like rescue swift, visible, unambiguous. But Padre Pio's life tells a different story. He received the stigmata in September of 1918 and bore those wounds until his death in September of 1968, 50 years to the month. 50 years of physical pain, of spiritual darkness, of being misunderstood by church authorities, of having his ministry suspended, of being investigated and doubted, and at times restricted from the very sacraments he lived to offer. 50 years during which God was restoring him, and restoring, through him, hundreds of thousands of souls in a way that looked, from the outside, like a very long form of suffering. This is not a comfortable truth, but it is a liberating one. Because once you understand how God actually works, not how we wish he would work, but how he does something inside you, begins to stop fighting the process. And when you stop fighting the process begins to move. The second great teaching of Padre Pio is this: God restores the soul primarily through what the soul cannot control. Not through your best efforts, not through your willpower or your spiritual discipline alone, though those matter, and Padre Pio would be the first to insist on them, but through the circumstances, the people, the sufferings, the silences that arrive in your life without your permission and refuse to leave on your schedule. He wrote to one of his spiritual daughters, "In the spiritual life, the crosses we did not choose are more fruitful than those we chose ourselves." Read that again. The crosses you did not choose. The illness that came without warning. The relationship that broke in a way you could not have predicted. The season of dryness in prayer that arrived just when you thought you had finally learned to pray. The humiliation that came not because you were wrong, but because you were right, and no one believed you. These are not interruptions to your restoration. They are the instruments of it. St. Paul speaks of this in his letter to the Romans with a precision that can only come from experience. We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, not in some things, not in the pleasant things, in all things. The Greek word he uses, synerge, carries the image of something working together, cooperating, each element contributing to a single outcome that none of the elements, taken alone, could have produced. God is a master of synergy. He takes your weakness and his grace and the circumstances you would never have chosen, and he works them together patiently, persistently, invisibly toward the wholeness you long for. Padre Pio understood this with his whole being. His letters speak, again and again, of a single spiritual movement, surrender. Not the surrender of defeat, not giving up, not collapsing into despair, but the surrender of trust, the act of releasing your grip on the outcome of your own restoration and placing it deliberately into hands that are more skilled than yours. He wrote, "Pray, hope, and don't worry. Worry is useless. God is merciful and will hear your prayer." That phrase, pray, hope, and don't worry, is probably his most quoted, and it is easy to receive it sentimentally, the way you might receive a quote on a decorative pillow. But behind it is a theological conviction so deep it shaped every hour of Padre Pio's life, that God is not passive, that he is actively working in you, toward you, through everything that touches you, and that your anxiety, your white-knuckled need to manage your own healing, is the one thing most likely to slow the process down. This does not mean passivity. Padre Pio spent hours in prayer each day. He fasted. He offered his suffering. He went to confession regularly and encouraged everyone who came to him to do the same. He cooperated with grace with every ounce of his will, but he did not try to be his own restorer. He placed himself daily, deliberately in the hands of the one who actually knew how. And this is the invitation to you. Here, in whatever season you find yourself in, what is the thing in your life right now that you cannot control? The outcome you keep trying to manage, the wound you keep trying to treat yourself, the person you keep trying to change, the version of yourself you keep trying to produce through sheer effort. What if exactly that is where God's hands are already working? What if the thing you cannot fix is the very place he is doing his most careful work? You do not have to understand it. You do not have to feel it. You only have to stay present, prayerful, willing, and let him do what only he can do. There is something Padre Pio said to the many souls who came to him, wounded, weary, half persuaded that God had given up on them. He did not give them a lecture. He did not hand them a program. He looked at them, and people who experienced that gaze described it as something uncanny, something that seemed to see through them and past them, to something in them they had not yet seen themselves. And then he would say, in one form or another, God has not forgotten you. He is closer to you than your own suffering. Closer than your own suffering. Not beside it, not above it. Closer, this is the third movement of what Padre Pio teaches, the one that changes not just how you receive your own restoration, but what you do with it. Because God does not restore a soul simply so it can feel better. He restores a soul so that it can become, in his hands, an instrument of restoration for others. The stigmata of Padre Pio were not private. They were public. And they were uncomfortable, and they made many people around him unsettled. And they drew thousands, literally hundreds of thousands of souls to confession, to prayer, to conversion. Because there is something about a visible wound that cannot be explained away. that cannot be reduced to sentiment or metaphor, that forces the question, what is happening here? Your wound, the one you are carrying, the one you have perhaps been ashamed of, the one you have tried to conceal because you feared it would disqualify you, your wound, held in grace, becomes exactly that kind of sign. Not because suffering is beautiful in itself. Padre Pio would never say that. He did not romanticize pain. He offered it, which is a different thing entirely. To romanticize suffering is to stay with it, to circle it, to make it the center of your story. To offer suffering is to place it on the altar, to give it to the one who can do something with it that you cannot. The difference is everything. The Apostle Paul writes in his second letter to the Corinthians with startling directness, he comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. This is not a pious sentiment. It is a theological description of how the body of Christ actually functions. Grace flows through conduits. The comfort you receive in your brokenness is not yours to keep, it is yours to pass on, in the exact form that someone near you most needs to receive it. The person who has never doubted cannot fully reach the person drowning in doubt. The person who has never lost cannot sit with the one who has lost everything. But you carrying your particular wound, having walked your particular darkness, having arrived at whatever fragile and hard-won place of grace you now occupy, you can reach someone that no one else in the world can reach. This is what Padre Pio understood about his stigmata. They were not his. They were given to him for others. Every pain offered, every prayer whispered in the dark at 3 a.m, every hour in the confessional when he bore, spiritually, the weight of another person's sin and shame, all of it flowing outward, through him, from the heart of God to the hearts of those who did not yet know they were loved. He once wrote, "More souls go to hell because of sins against purity than for any other reason." And he poured his suffering into the breach, praying, fasting, interceding for the very souls who did not know anyone was fighting for them. Because that is what a restored soul does. It turns its face outward. It remembers what it felt like to be lost, and it refuses to stop looking for the ones who are still lost. What does this mean for you, practically, in the ordinary texture of your daily life? It means that the restoration God is working in you is never just for you. The patience you are learning in this difficult season will be exactly the patience someone needs to receive from you in a season that has not yet come. The faith you are rebuilding, stone by stone, in the silence that faith will one day speak to someone who cannot yet believe, and what you say will carry a weight that no theology lecture ever could, because it will carry the weight of experience. Your wound is not a disqualification. It is a preparation. And the God who has been patiently, lovingly, invisibly working in you all this time, he is not done. He is not going to leave you half restored. He is going to complete what he began. With the same patience he brought to 50 years of Padre Pio's life. With the same precision he brings to the restoration of a painting no one else thought was worth saving. You are worth saving. You are being saved. And one day, in a moment you cannot yet predict, in a conversation you cannot yet imagine, the work he did in the dark will step into the light, and someone who needed it desperately will receive it through you. Stay, pray, offer, and trust, not because it is easy, but because the one doing the work is faithful, and he has never, not once, left a longing soul unanswered. You stayed until the end. That matters, not to the algorithm to me, And I believe more than I can fully explain that it matters to God too. Because the soul that stays, that sits with the hard things, that refuses to look away, that is the soul that gets reached. If what you heard today moved something in you, or named something you had been carrying without words, I want to invite you to go deeper with this community. Becoming a member of this channel means you help keep this work alive. It means more voices of the saints, more spiritual wisdom, more of these quiet hours together that remind us we are not alone in what we carry. The saints were not untouchable. They were broken, restored, and given back to the world exactly like you and me. Come and be covered too.